I do have a special announcement to make, and it is my deepest pleasure to have this day come. Last June, as we celebrated the installation of Symbiosis, which most of you know was on loan for a year, courtesy of the artist and Marianne Boesky Gallery, we installed it with the cooperation of Philadelphia's Department of Parks and Recreation. And at that time, I observed that the sculpture nestled between Fremier's gilded Joan of Arc and de Souvreau's very different, robust Iroquois just seemed so right. I said then that I thought it would be a dream come true if Symbiosis struck the heart of someone who would help purchase it. And sometimes dreams come true. We are profoundly grateful to Dan Dietrich, who is here with us tonight. Dan, this generous gift to the aPA, and by extension to the public, the city, our visitors, is such a major gift. Thank you so much. It's an extraordinary addition to this exceptional experience of public art that unfolds down the Parkway, for example. And Symbiosis creates this dialogue with the nearby sculpture and architecture and landscape in terms of form and color, substance, scale, and ambiguity. Symbiosis unfolds. I think that's why everybody loves it so much. It doesn't reveal itself to you all at once. It extends an invitation to you to take time, to slow down, to come closer and experience it firsthand. And it's with that thought in mind that it's my great pleasure to introduce Dan Dietrich to you, who is a man of generous spirit as well as support, trust me. And he's agreed to say a few words this evening and let you know about this fantastic gift that we accept on behalf of the aPA.
You're all such dear people. I'm very happy to help assist in making this piece of sculpture come to Philadelphia. It operates in such a different way than some sculpture that is proud and heroic and stands out in the sun and commemorates people and maybe speaks of issues of hope and maybe even larger emotions than that. What we have here, and it astonished me when I first saw it next to the de Souvreau, is an enigma, a faceted enigma that doesn't, it sends you back into yourself. It's as if it's in the landscape, it's going to take you back into yours. And its proximity to Aiken's Oval, which is where the Philadelphia has left its honoring of Thomas Eakins, except for the great museum here that has, in a sense, put him back where he belonged. There's a tension up in that area around that little island of green between this piece and the de Souvreau on this small island that swirls with cars. It has a hushed voice, and it's enigmatic to me. You have a tree form that's fallen into another tree, a smaller tree, a sapling. You wonder, were these comrades? I mean, what exactly is happening here? It's almost out of a Hudson River School painting, the blasted tree. Except it lies on top of another, and it has died. It cannot regenerate, and the tree that it has fallen into is clearly more than likely going to die as well. And yet, in the midst of this looping, this symbiosis in a way, an arch is created through the middle. And the arch itself as a form is almost like taking what is in nature and leaving us back in the ruins something architectural. And arches have always been known as points of triumph or great battles won and points of joy. And this is much more ambivalent, of course, and is more like a doorway, in a sense, out into the world of Philadelphia. But the piece belongs here. I love the Art Association. I think they've just done incredible work all these years, and to be able to add a piece that in a way is part of the emotional spine of the city. I mean, all these sculptures in a way are humanistic, part of a humanistic spine that runs through our city, which is a backward city in some ways and great for poets. It's great for sculpture too. We can scale ourselves to it, and I'm very, very happy to be here and to have been able to help finally do something for the great people who have taken sculpture and made it not only something to champion, but something to, in a sense, explore beyond itself into a world that is maybe going to give us some hope and scale us better to each other in our community. So anyway, I thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Eccles, who will then introduce Roxy. And then they will be in conversation. I don't know exactly how this is going to go, which I think is the best part of what's going to happen. Tom is the executive director of the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York. I first met him when he was director of the Public Art Fund in New York from 1996 to 2005. And he really was a curator to watch. He curated more than 100 exhibitions and projects with the most impressive group of artists, both established and up and coming. He organized a number of outdoor projects in collaboration with New York City institutions, including the New Museum, the Whitney Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art. Tom studied philosophy, aesthetics, and semiotics at the University of Bologna and graduated from the University of Glasgow with an MA in philosophy and Italian. I think it's all strangely useful in this conversation today. And here's the connection, or at least the one I know. Tom commissioned one of Roxy's early dendroids, Bluff, for the Public Art Fund and the Whitney Biennale in 2002 when it was installed temporarily in Central Park. Symbiosis is also a dendroid, and I'm sure that they'll talk about that. The New York Times has referred to Tom as a provocateur. They say he's impudent, ebullient, and inventive, and I would have to agree. And so because of that, we're so excited to have him here with us tonight, as eager as you are to hear what he has to say and what he and Roxy have to say in conversation in celebration of this fantastic evening of the acquisition of Roxy Symbiosis that will stay in Philadelphia. Tom?
Thank you, Penny. Penny's a legendary figure in the world of public art, but not only in America, but also globally. I actually knew of her before I came to the United States from Glasgow, and Philadelphia has always been a beacon of art in public spaces, as well as public art, and thinking through what's next and developing programs. Particularly, I think, this very, very rich tradition of art being integrated within the fabric of the city. And you can see it here with the way Penny's been thinking through how to reach out and talk about the works and educate people about works of art using new media, social media as well. So obviously delighted to be here tonight, where, you know, what a great honor to be here at a moment of celebration, and Dan's incredible gift of Symbiosis to the city. I'm not going to do, I'm rather embarrassed by Penny's introduction there, and I certainly can't do the same for Roxy, who deserves much more. Roxy and I, you know, actually go back quite a long way. I thought it was 10 years ago, but it turns out to be 17 years ago. But there was a particular moment, I think a very important moment in the history of certainly the city of New York and of public art, when Roxy really triumphed. And you know, in the aftermath of 9/11, you know, before 9/11, I used to try to irritate people as much as possible with the projects we commissioned, or at least, you know, like actually try to do something that would actually wake people up, or would find a very particular audience. Certainly weren't projects that were for everybody, didn't aim to please, and often engaged humor in different modes, irony, sarcasm, and other forms of criticism in some form. And also they were unabashedly they had an unabashed belief in the value of art itself. One of Mayor Giuliani's people once said to me, "I don't like you, and I don't like what you do." And I said, "Well, with all due respect, I don't like the Yankees." And but I'm sure we can all you know, find enough space in the city for our interests. And you know, but then 9/11 happened, and you know, boom, 9/11 happens, and in that kind of grim aftermath, I had a rather strange and rather painful task of identifying the lost sculpture in the area around the World Trade Center. It's quite funny, actually. The Daily News called me up and said, "Has anything like this ever happened before?" And so, well, you know, I know World War II, you know, like the loss of art, you know, the great loss of art is sort of almost is irrelevant almost when one looks at the loss of life in these occasions, and trying to think through, well, what do we do next? How you know, maybe the game's up here somehow. Maybe, you know, whatever the program was had to change, or at least react to this situation. And it was, you know, it was like, I don't know, mid-October of 2001, and you know, all of the projects we were doing, they start with a dialogue, and I've been in dialogue with Roxy for quite a while, and he'd done the most remarkable little sculpture in the woods in Sweden, in a place called Wannäs. So it was called Imposter. And it was a little stainless steel. It was only about 16 feet. It wasn't a huge piece. 27 feet. Well, it was certainly smaller than the one we were commissioning. And thinking about, you know, thinking about, you know, what might one be able to show, and where one might be able to make an impact. And we'd been invited to organize the sort of outdoor component to the Whitney Biennial. And at that point, Central Park was completely, there was a moratorium on art in Central Park due to the fact that Christo was proposing the Gates project for Central Park. And they felt, well, you know, if you allow anybody else to make art in Central Park, this then opens the gates to the Gates. And I caught the commissioner of parks on a day we're both covered in dust, and I'd say, well, look, do you think we might be able to show Roxy Paine, a piece by Roxy Paine? He's proposing a 50-foot, 55-foot tree, stainless steel tree, and called Bluff, and I'd like to do it in February. And it just changed, it was transformative. He said, well, why wouldn't we want to do that right now, you know? And right at that moment, it was interesting, you know, that all the leaves on the trees were off. It was a very dark winter. You could sort of smell the World Trade Center. You had the park bare. Among the among the American elms, these fabulous American elms, we cited bluff, which was a triumph of will, really, from Roxy. I mean, there's one thing you can say about Roxy Paine, is he's a damn hard worker. And the precision of the piece in its place, among the nudity of nature at that moment and this bleakness, suddenly over time became transformed by the return of spring, and became. It was kind of astonishing. It made the cover of the New York Times, but also became a kind of locus for a place where people could gather, people could actually think about, not so much look just at the piece, and I think Penny brings this out with Symbiosis, how it appears in winter, but also look at that which is around them, and actually sculpture, not necessarily a thing one focuses on in public space, but allows one to kind of open one's mind to kind of broader realities. So that was the kind of, I think, a real turning point in the history of art in our city. I'm delighted to see Symbiosis here, which I think is really one of the triumphs of the Dendroid series. Now, what we're going to do, I believe, because I don't totally know, I think Roxy is going to give you a trajectory of his work, and I'll maybe intervene a few times. I mean, what you find with Roxy is he's one of these, he's an artist without a signature style. You know, you could look at the piece behind us, would we know that was a work by Roxy. He does, however, have three main strands of works. One, of course, is the dendroids, the tree-like forms from the Greek, and one of which the kind of best example is the one that you now own as the people of Philadelphia. The other is replicants. This is one example here, which often involve weeds or fungi, poisonous, also often referring to different forms of crops, often hallucinogens. And Roxy has a troubled history. As a youth, actually ran away at the age of 15. He was born in New York in '66, but moved to Northern Virginia, to the suburbs of Northern Virginia. Probably, I saw a book that was claiming in the post-war period. It's actually the Nixon, Carter years, but you know, you can imagine that place with these kind of manicured lawns. And I think one of the things that was kind of made a strong impression on the young Paine was all these borders, the borders of the gardens, the hedgerows, the manicured lawns, and I know that he transgressed outside of his own borders into the more weedy areas, the uncultivated edges of suburbia, where he discovered some of the delights of teenagehood. From there, which quite informative to the work. From there, he actually ran away at 15, and I don't know if I'm wrong or right, but I do believe he went into some of the kind of great geological landscapes of the West, which also inform his work. He's always been a kind of extremely keen observer, and you can see that throughout the work. And the works are always phenomenally, intricately produced, often with surprising materials, often creating a sense of surprise and awe. In the third kind of work where this shows up is in his series of machines and do-it-yourself kits, which have taken on different forms over probably a 20-year, 25-year career, and are now finding their way into maybe the fourth series of work, which are these intricate dioramas made of birch and maple. I think Roxy asks kind of quite difficult question, do we exist inside or outside of nature and technology? What is our relationship to the machines we've created? Can we draw a line between the processes of nature, whose forms are determined by genetic or geological laws, and those of technology following mathematical algorithms? I think there are sort of four perspectives that we might bring up tonight with Roxy's work. One is the conflict between nature and industry. Another is the language systems as a metaphor, identifying similar organizing structures in the disparate realms of nature and industry. which I think Roxy reconciles while embracing the roles played by chance and variation. There's always a concern for control and chaos, and our attempts to control, nature in particular. And then we have, and we're here in the Philadelphia Museum, the work always has a complex dialogue with the tenets of modernism and postmodernism. And as I said before, I think humor also plays a rather large role in Roxy's work. So we're going to start tonight with a work called Dinner of the Dictators from 93-95, and this was the one of the first works I actually proposed for a public exhibition. It's a dinner party of dictators and their favorite meals, and it was the first rejection I ever had as a curator of public space. So please welcome Roxy Paine.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. Well, first, I'd like to just really thank Penny and the aPA and Susan and Barbara for your enthusiasm and shepherding Symbiosis through all the roadblocks and bumps and meanderings that were necessary. So I really am grateful to you, and also grateful to be in such a great city for public art, and a city which really, you can see the dedication to art in public, and largely due to your efforts, I think. So, also, I'd like to thank Dan for making this happen and making it permanent. So, so it's also very fitting that here with Tom, because Tom was the first one to bring a Dendroid to the U.S. After I'd done two in Europe, Tom was also quite a shepherd, bringing Bluff to New York City and making that happen. So I just wanted to show a kind of cross-section of the work, and not complete by any means, but just kind of show some of my obsessions and concerns and thought processes that may give more information about Symbiosis. So this is a piece called Dinner of the Dictators. It was a piece I researched for about 2 years, trying to find favorite meals, or a meal that was actually recorded to have been eaten by these particular dictators. I then took that information and prepared the meals, or worked with different chefs to prepare the meals, and then worked with a taxidermist to freeze dry all the meals, and then they're kept in this dehumidified chamber, because ideas of preservation with food is dryness is key. So this kind of creating this kind of parched desert landscape within, or atmosphere within this chamber. So here's a.
So it's Hitler, Castro, Mao.
Castro was not in my list, but Mao, Chiang Kai-shek, Franco, Stalin, Mussolini, Somoza, Genghis Khan. Kind of a, yeah, sort of crossing time as well as geography, but and this, when I was working on this piece and these ideas, it was actually when I had the first ideas for the dioramas, which we'll get to later on, but this was a piece from '97 called Model for an Abstract Sculpture. And another idea that Tom didn't mention that's an obsession of mine is this idea of potential and things existing in a state of waiting to reach a certain potential and being frozen in this state. So this piece is this sculpture that will never be. I mean, it is a sculpture as it is, but it will never reach its final form. And it's playing with the idea of the model kit and the model kit that it won't ever be taken apart. This is actually from '95 as well, and this is a piece called Placard Fillinger, and it was based on a session with my therapist at the time, a 50-minute session, and which was about 2,000 words, because I don't talk that much, but so the words were in sequence, and each day of the exhibition, the words were loaded in 100 at a time and flung every 5 minutes. So during the 6 weeks of the exhibition, the 50-minute session was played out. So in theory, you could learn something very revealing about me, but you would have to devote a great deal of time. And then this piece is also playing with the ideas that are other ideas of this interplay between chance and control and impossibility of control. So though everything began in order, it soon devolved into this massive pile of placards collecting in the corner. And one of the machines, the first machine was called the paint tipper, and it created paintings by repeatedly dipping the canvas into a vat of acrylic paint. So again this this interplay between intensive control and chance, or complexity of interaction of natural forces. So on the surface of the paintings, you have the evidence of the control, and then below the paintings, you have the uncontrollable, the stalactites. Also present in this piece is my very deep interest in geology, and so though they're made by this machine process and this very controlled to the millisecond computer controlled apparatus, you have this this completely unique fingerprint with each painting. And then this is the Scumac machine from Scumac number 2 from '99. This creates these polyethylene sculptures, and each sculpture has constraints. It has very strict number of layers that it's producing. It has it's controlled again to the millisecond in its dispensing and its cooling cycles. But then, because of the complexity of gravity and thermodynamics and even the room temperature, all influencing this, they become out of my control. So.
Could you also talk about these? You did also a painting manufactured unit and a drawing unit. Could you talk about drawing machine? Could you talk about these as a form of commentary on art production?
I mean, they are multiple in their references and meanings. I mean, there is a part that is thinking about that or addressing that, but I would say some people interpret them as being just about that. Mm-hmm. And if that was my project, it wouldn't be interesting to me.
I mean, a lot of people have read, particularly the two-dimensional the machines that result in two-dimensional work, as a kind of undercutting of the vaunted spontaneity of abstract expressionism, for example. Mm-hmm. Or
yeah, particularly painters seem to take offense sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's not intended to offend. I mean, it's intended to provoke thought about what it means for what it means to have a machine, to have the machine as your surrogate producer. What it means to have. But you know, it's also there's been other machines that make art, but often it's very kind of not very interesting what is produced in the end, like a kind of scratchy drawing, or you know. For me, it was very important that the result actually be a compelling art object, and not just because it was made by a machine.
They were also made, I mean, it's interesting now because they sort of came about at a time when the art market wasn't particularly at its height, but also it was quite interesting as a way of sort of undermining Roxy's own market in some weird way. Like they were, you know, because they weren't, I don't think the Scumacs were ever limited editions, no?
No, they're limited by when it's shown, it's producing. So when it's exhibited, it's producing, and so it's limited by how often it's shown. But I
mean, it kind of was Warhol an influence on this work? I mean, Warhol said, I think he said, "I want to be a machine." Mm-hmm. Did Warhol kind of influence the way you thought about producing these works?
Not especially, actually, but I mean, it's interesting to think about him in relationship to the work, but I wasn't especially thinking about him when I was working on these. But this is the PMU, which you mentioned, and so this took the ideas of the first painting machine and increased the possibilities and complexities. So this was a kind of a flow of paint. And you know, they're also very much concerned with industrial production and the you know, industrial flow of liquids through a factory, for instance, and recapturing the liquids. But so here's a few examples of the paintings. And again, so the idea of language is very important in my work, and with the machines, there's essentially two very different stages to the work. One is building the machine, and which is the establishment of the language, the parameters of the language, the elements, and the rules by which those elements are combined or applied. And then the second phase is really seeing what can be done with the language. So I've established the language, and then it's kind of like learning what it might be capable of. And so the paintings really have changed over time as certain aspects, certain things I want to bring out in little chance, kind of encouraging these little chance moments of which then become caverns or larger formations.
I think also that this piece is a good example. You were kind of at the forefront. These are almost the first examples that I can think of computer-generated art, or computers actually being utilized in the production of art, or setting through the, you know, Roxy would, I mean, you never saw in the mid-90s, you never saw computers sitting and being fed data or feeding out data and then that leading to production. And maybe you could just talk about how you came to that, and sort of certain forms of data being put in. So I can't think like what those would be now, but certain forms of data, the weather in Pennsylvania, would then turn out into a sculpture, for example. Yeah, well, this piece particularly. So this is called Erosion Machine, and this piece I would feed these 4,500-pound blocks of sandstone into, with a forklift, into this glass enclosed chamber with a robot that slowly erodes the blocks of stone. And how it erodes the stone is, and how the robot moves is determined by different data sets that I would feed into the computer. So the first block it did, I used weather data from actually Binghamton, New York. So wind speed, hours of sun, temperature, of course, humidity, and but not using it in a sort of graph way, but combining this data in a way where I wasn't completely sure what kind of forms would develop. And this stone, which is also a different type of stone, which is another aspect of the piece, which was very interesting to me, is taking this set of data, which is essentially a history, a kind of it's a record of history, and then applying this one record of history onto this stone block, which is
which is another recording of history. It's a recording of all of the surface conditions that were existing and what kind of pressure and and then whether it was pushed below the surface of the earth, and you know, it's this overlay and revealing of these two different histories together. So the data set that I used for this stone was stock market data from a particular time, and this is a detail of that piece. And this piece actually used crime statistics as a basis for the erosion. So another aspect of the work is the replicants. This is, or fields, and so this is a field of 2,000 mushrooms that each one made individually, made uniquely, which is important about the piece. And this was at the same time as the model for an abstract sculpture. So again, the idea of potential and the particularly the psychoactive potential of this particular fungus, and this field, also creating kind of an analog to the hallucinogenic experience, but without using any kind of exaggeration of color or form, but restricting myself to only the form of the actual mushroom triggering the experience. And again, this was a piece called Crop, and it's a kind of cut section of a field of poppies. And for this piece, I actually grew the poppies first to study them, and then set about actually creating them out of epoxy and polymers and steel and PETG, which is a kind of plastic. So again, it's this idea of potential, particularly embodied here, because it's a field of poppies that's in, and also it's you know, at first it appears as just this beautiful field of flowers, but all of my interest in nature is where humanity and nature intersect, and where that intersection creates particular nodes of trouble or harm or psychoactive potential, for instance.
Could I ask what, at this moment, there's a number of artists working in a similar manner. I mean, who were you looking at that moment? I mentioned Tony Mattelli, but you reminded me that Tony Mattelli was looking at you. But were you, which I believe is true, I actually believe is true. But were, you know, this is a moment when you're casting, you're creating, you've got a particular methodology. It's a certain kind of scale. There's also a kind of surprising kind of autobiographical element into the work. I mean, were you looking at someone like Robert Gober's work?
Well, certainly Gober was someone I was looking at early on.
The handmade, these are far away from the machines.
Yeah, well, handmade, but also that you I see often in the art world there's this kind of false dichotomy of like if something is like intensely crafted and with that kind of rigor, that it's not it can't be regarded as conceptually rigorous as well. Right. And I think Robert Gober was very important in that regard to kind of to make that boundary more permeable. So yeah, definitely very important to me. So this is a field. So it started shifting to the wall, and with the mushroom fields. This is a field of Amanita virosa, which is a very, very deadly mushroom. And another, speaking of categories and cataloging, is another of my interests is in the kind of control that is embodied in naming and categorizing and cataloging, in creating borders. So I was working on these pieces of these specimen cases, and taking a subject, which was in this case was like the paint blots and detritus from the painting process, like blobs that would fall on the floor, and creating a taxonomy of these, and it's kind of a vision of the categorizing part of our brains run amok, but in order to depict that running amok, I had to really get into that mode, and so I was really trying to understand and develop naming systems for all these different types of forms so I'd make thousands of these blobs, and then the second phase would be coming in and really trying to classify them. This one is called pigeonholes. Yeah. So, which is also something, being interested in more permeable boundaries. Which in my work you see a lot of different ways of approaching making work, and that's because I'm very much I'm not interested in this kind of pigeonholing or easy labeling or this kind of the limitations of labeling. And just scale-wise, this one I think is about 5 by 7 feet. I just realized I haven't been giving you any idea of the sizes of these pieces, but. So in 2002, a very visionary curator invited me to do
Blind fool.
to do this project in Central Park. Or originally we were going to do it outside of Central Park,
Yeah,
at the
Central
entrance.
Park. Yeah.
So that became this Project Bluff, which is, I'd done 2 others in Europe, but they weren't of this kind of scale and complexity. But I think it was necessary to do those first 2 to figure out how to
Can you talk a little bit? I know we don't have a lot more time, and so we'll probably just talk a little bit about the dendroids. But could you just talk? I think people will be interested in the process of how you actually conceive of each individual work. I know that Bluff is an amalgam of different kinds of trees. Everybody would say, "Oh, what kind of tree is this?" And it isn't a kind of tree. It's,
Right.
You know, it's an invention in a way. But
Right.
how do you? I mean, you used to make very, very beautiful drawings of each of the exact parts, almost technical drawings. But and here we saw that you bring in the model. I mean, do they start with a model?
Well, they start with drawings, but then the model is really an extension of the drawing for me. It's the model is a kind of drawing as well. But I'd just like to talk a little bit about the idea of language with these pieces, and the idea of translation. So with these pieces, it's very important to me that nothing is cast. So it's not reproduction. It's not taking some existing entity, casting it and reproducing it. It's taking the language of different dendritic structures, a tree, a neuron, a vascular system, a river delta, and taking that organic natural language and translating it into an industrial language, and translating it into an industrial language using only industrial means, so using pipe and plate, which is rolled and bent with massive hydraulic presses and then welded. So there's a kind of breaking down into component parts and then reconstructing aspect with this process of translation.
I think people don't know as well that it's incredible physical work. It's actually very physically draining on you to make one of these. It's mentally draining. It occupies your time and space, and it also involves really noxious chemicals, right?
Well, stainless steel is unfortunately, it does produce fumes, bad fumes. And early on, I was much more cavalier about the protection from such things. But now, I'm completely anal about every the supplied air systems for the respirators and things like that. But and for my guys who work with me on it.
So they've actually become more industrial in some ways. So you're now showing the welds more than before. Is that correct, or am I wrong? I was actually looking at Symbiosis, which doesn't show the welds as much as I thought it might.
Well, on the trunks,
So revealing its construction.
yeah, I mean, the construction is revealed by, I mean, there's kind of an awkward smoothness to all the movements, like, and you can, but you can see where all the joints are, you know, where every seam was, and when you get into the branches 6 inches and below, then you see all the welds.
Can you talk? Dan mentioned it briefly in his description of symbiosis. There's always this kind of struggle between life and death in these works, and you always, I mean, with Bluff, I think there may be one on symbiosis. These shelf mushrooms, which are an indicator that the tree is either dead or dying. No.
Yeah. Well, it actually the fungus in some cases can be symbiotic. It can be parasitic, or it can be saprophilic, which means death-loving. Basically, it means like a fungus that grows on once it's already dead. So that is left as a question: which kind of fungus is particularly? But I mean, I think. Yeah, it's interesting, the things you mentioned about the piece, and for me, some of my work I exercise a conscious restraint in terms of metaphoric potential, and other works such as Symbiosis, I think I let the reins go a little bit more, and I think it does open itself up to a lot of different. I mean, I think of falling, and its potential for falling, but it's prevented actually from reaching its falling potential. So that other tree can be seen as something helping it, or something that is actually preventing its destiny, or what have you. So, and you know, it can certainly be interpreted in, well, I don't want to voice all the possible interpretations, but I think it's very, I like that it has an openness to that metaphoric reading of it.
And can I ask why stainless steel?
I mean, for one, and in particular with Symbiosis, it's interesting that it's a material which is, you know, humans' best attempt at making something permanent, or something that is susceptible to the ravages of time, and creating something that is clearly susceptible to the ravages of time, and out of a material. I'm interested in that kind of material contradiction.
So maybe I'll just, I just remembered, when we put Bluff in Central Park, it was a very rainy, stormy day. It was a stormy kind of January, and we just finished it, and so people coming and hugging it and what have you, and there's some lightning in the distance, and I thought, we didn't think about grounding this tree. They call rockers, and we better get over here and ground this tree. On that, I know that we're going to go into reception, so I'd really like to thank Roxy Paine.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.